Welcome, traveler. I activate my balm of stars to soothe your rest and guide your learning. Let us begin the journey. We begin not with explosions or the clash of arms, but with a question. Why study war? It seems a grim subject, doesn't it? Perhaps even a morbid one. But the study of war isn't about glorifying conflict. It's about understanding a fundamental and tragically persistent aspect of the human condition. Throughout history, war has shaped civilizations, redrawn maps, and profoundly impacted the lives of billions. Ignoring it, pretending it doesn't matter, simply isn't an option if we wish to understand the world around us. Moreover, understanding the causes of war, the factors that lead nations to fight, is the first step towards preventing future conflicts. It's a difficult task, yes, but a profoundly important one. We aren't seeking simple answers, but rather a nuanced and comprehensive understanding of this complex phenomenon. We'll explore how wars begin, how they are fought, and crucially, what can be done to avoid them. Consider this course as a deep dive into the anatomy of conflict, examining its roots, its mechanics, and its consequences. It's not about taking sides, but about seeking truth. Thinking about war as merely a series of military engagements is a mistake. It's a political act, a continuation of politics by other means, as the famous strategist Karl von Clausewitz observed. This means that to understand war, we need to examine the political, economic, and social factors that contribute to it. We'll investigate the role of leaders, ideologies, and national interests. What motivates states to go to war? Is it a quest for resources, a desire for power, or a clash of values? These are the questions we will grapple with. Furthermore, the study of war is intimately connected to the study of peace. Understanding what causes conflict also helps us identify the conditions that promote cooperation and stability. The goal isn't simply to understand how wars happen, but also why they don't happen more often. There are periods of relative peace in history, and understanding those periods is just as important as understanding the periods of conflict. We will look at the roles of international organizations, diplomacy, and economic interdependence in maintaining peace. Finally, let's consider the practical implications of this study. Understanding the causes of war isn't just an academic exercise. It has real-world consequences. It can inform policy decisions, guide diplomatic efforts, and help us develop strategies for conflict prevention. By learning from the mistakes of the past, we can hopefully avoid repeating them in the future. This course isn't about advocating for a particular ideology or political agenda. It's about providing you with the analytical tools and critical thinking skills necessary to understand the complex world around you. We will strive for objectivity and intellectual honesty, acknowledging the limitations of our knowledge and the inherent complexities of the subject matter. Remember, the goal isn't to find the answer, but to ask the right questions. And that is where our journey begins. Defining war seems straightforward, doesn't it? But surprisingly, it's a surprisingly contentious issue. The traditional definition, large-scale armed conflict between states, is increasingly inadequate in the 21st century. We see conflicts involving non-state actors, terrorist groups, insurgencies, criminal organizations that don't fit neatly into this framework. Furthermore, the line between war and peace has become increasingly blurred. We have seen so-called grey zone conflicts, operations that fall below the threshold of traditional warfare, but are still aggressive and destabilizing. So, what is war? For the purposes of this course, we'll adopt a broad definition: a sustained, organized, and intentional use of lethal force by political entities, whether states or non-state actors, to achieve political goals. This definition acknowledges the changing nature of conflict and allows us to analyze a wider range of cases. It's also crucial to distinguish between war and other forms of conflict. Conflict is a much broader term, encompassing any situation where two or more actors have incompatible goals or interests. Conflict can be peaceful. Think of a political debate or a business negotiation, or it can be violent. War is simply the most extreme and violent form of conflict. We also need to consider the distinction between direct and indirect warfare. Direct warfare involves physical combat between opposing forces. Indirect warfare, on the other hand, involves tactics such as economic sanctions, cyber attacks, and propaganda. These tactics may not involve direct violence, but they can still be highly destructive and destabilizing. Recognizing these different forms of conflict is essential for understanding the complexities of the modern security environment. The nature of conflict is evolving, and we must adapt our analytical frameworks accordingly. Finally, it's important to recognize that war isn't just a physical phenomenon. It's also a social and psychological one. War has profound impacts on individuals, communities, and societies. It can lead to trauma, displacement, and long-term psychological damage. It can also exacerbate existing social inequalities and create new ones. Understanding these social and psychological dimensions of war is crucial for developing effective strategies for conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction. War isn't simply about winning or losing battles. It's about the human cost of conflict and the long-term consequences for all involved. We must always remember that behind every statistic and every military operation, there are real people whose lives are being affected. Over the next 12 chapters, we will embark on a journey to understand the causes of war. We'll move beyond simplistic explanations and delve into the complex interplay of factors that contribute to conflict. Each chapter will focus on a specific level of analysis, moving from the individual level, examining the role of leaders and decision-makers, to the systemic level, exploring the impact of the international system. We'll examine different theoretical perspectives: realism, liberalism, constructivism, and assess their strengths and weaknesses. We'll also analyze a range of historical and contemporary case studies, from the Peloponnesian War to the Syrian Civil War, to illustrate the key concepts and principles. Specifically, we'll cover topics such as the security dilemma, the role of ideology, the impact of economic interests, the influence of domestic politics, and the effectiveness of international institutions. We'll also examine the evolving nature of warfare, including the rise of non-state actors, the increasing use of cyber warfare, and the challenges of peacekeeping and peacebuilding. Throughout the course, we'll emphasize critical thinking and analytical skills, encouraging you to question assumptions, evaluate evidence, and form your own informed opinions. This isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about learning how to think critically about complex issues. By the end of this course, you will have a deeper understanding of the causes of war and the challenges of achieving lasting peace. You will be equipped with the analytical tools and critical thinking skills necessary to engage in informed discussions about international security and to contribute to efforts to prevent and resolve conflict. This course is a challenging one, but it is also a rewarding one. I hope you are prepared to embark on this journey with an open mind and a willingness to learn. Welcome to the course. We begin our exploration of classical realism with a journey back to ancient Greece, specifically to Thucydides and his account of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides wasn't just a historian. He was a political thinker who believed that understanding history required stripping away moral judgments and focusing on the underlying causes of conflict. He saw the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta, not as a clash between good and evil, but as a consequence of inherent power dynamics and the fear that drives states to act. He believed that states, like individuals, are motivated by their own self-interest and a desire for power. It's a rather stark view, isn't it? But Thucydides was striving for a ruthless honesty in his analysis, a commitment to seeing the world as it is, rather than as it ought to be. He wasn't interested in wishful thinking or moralizing. His goal was to uncover the patterns of behavior that lead to war, and to provide a framework for understanding international politics that would be applicable across time and place. Central to understanding Thucydides' perspective is the Melian dialogue, a famous passage from his History of the Peloponnesian War. This dialogue takes place between the Athenian envoys and the leaders of Melos, a small, neutral island state. Athens, a rising power, demands that Melos surrender and join their empire. Melos argues that they should be allowed to remain neutral, citing their small size and lack of resources to challenge Athens. However, the Athenians reject this plea. They famously state, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." It's a brutal assessment of international relations, devoid of any pretense of morality or justice. The Athenians don't offer Melos any moral justification for their demands. They simply assert their superior power and the inevitability of their dominance. They believe that states act according to their own self-interest, and that morality is irrelevant in the realm of international politics. The Athenian ultimatum isn't based on any grievance or provocation from Melos. They simply want to expand their empire and secure their power. And when Melos refuses to surrender, Athens invades, kills all the men, and enslaves the women and children. This tragic outcome, according to Thucydides, isn't an aberration. It's a logical consequence of the inherent logic of international politics. He argues that states are constantly engaged in a struggle for power, and that this struggle is driven by fear, self-interest, and a desire for security. Morality, justice, and international law are all secondary considerations. They are tools that states may use to advance their interests, but they are not fundamental principles that govern their behavior. The Melian dialogue, therefore, serves as a stark reminder of the harsh realities of power politics and the limitations of morality in a world driven by self-interest. Classical realism doesn't see the source of conflict solely in the structure of the international system. It delves deeper, suggesting that the roots of conflict lie within human nature itself. Realists believe that humans are inherently selfish, power-seeking, and prone to fear and distrust. This isn't necessarily a moral judgment. It's a descriptive claim about the fundamental characteristics of human beings. They argue that these traits are not unique to any particular culture or historical period. They are universal and enduring. This inherent drive for power isn't necessarily malicious. It's simply a fundamental aspect of human existence, a consequence of our desire for security, survival, and the fulfillment of our needs. In essence, realists suggest that if human beings were differentive, they were inherently altruistic, cooperative, and trusting the international system would be different as well. This pessimistic view of human nature leads realists to believe that international politics is inherently conflictual. They argue that states are essentially self-help actors, meaning that they must rely on their own resources to ensure their survival and security. There is no higher authority to protect them, and they cannot rely on the goodwill of other states. This creates a security dilemma, a situation in which one state's efforts to enhance its security are perceived as threatening by other states, leading them to take countermeasures, which in turn increase the insecurity of the first state. This cycle of action and reaction can escalate into a full-blown conflict, even if no one initially intended to start a war. The security dilemma highlights the inherent dangers of anarchy in the international system, where the absence of a central authority creates a constant fear of predation and a never-ending quest for power. It's important to note that classical realism doesn't necessarily advocate for aggressive or expansionist policies. It simply argues that states must prioritize their own security and survival, even if it means acting in ways that may be considered immoral or unjust. This doesn't mean that realists believe that war is inevitable or desirable. They simply believe that it is a constant possibility in a world where states are driven by self-interest and fear. Understanding this fundamental dynamic is crucial for understanding the patterns of conflict and cooperation in international politics. By recognizing the inherent limitations of morality and the enduring power of self-interest, we can begin to develop a more realistic and effective approach to foreign policy. For classical realists, the concept of national interest is central to understanding state behavior. But what exactly constitutes national interest? It's not simply a matter of altruism or idealism. For realists, national interest is defined in terms of power. States seek to maximize their power in order to ensure their survival and security. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are constantly striving for global domination. It simply means that they must maintain a sufficient level of power to deter potential aggressors and protect their core interests. These core interests typically include territorial integrity, political independence, and economic well-being. However, the specific definition of national interest can vary depending on the state's circumstances, its history, and its values. It's a fluid concept, constantly evolving in response to changing conditions. Security, therefore, is the primary goal of states. And for realists, security is not simply the absence of threats. It's the ability to protect oneself from those threats, even in the face of adversity. This requires maintaining a strong military, developing a robust economy, and forging strategic alliances. However, realists also recognize that security is not absolute. There is always a degree of risk and uncertainty in international politics. States can never be completely secure, and they must always be prepared to defend their interests. This constant struggle for security is what drives the dynamics of international politics, leading to competition, conflict, and cooperation. Classical realism doesn't ignore the role of ideology, culture, or domestic politics in shaping state behavior. However, it argues that these factors are ultimately subordinate to the fundamental drive for power and security. States may pursue different goals and adopt different strategies, but they are all ultimately constrained by the realities of the international system. Understanding these fundamental constraints is crucial for developing a realistic and effective approach to foreign policy. By recognizing the enduring importance of power, security, and national interest, we can begin to navigate the complexities of international politics and promote a more stable and peaceful world. Now, let's begin to unravel a core concept in neorealism: the idea of anarchy in the international system. When political scientists use the term anarchy, it doesn't mean chaos in the everyday sense. Instead, it describes the absence of a central, overarching authority above states. There isn't a world government to enforce rules, settle disputes, or protect states from each other. Think of it as a system where each state is, in principle, responsible for its own security. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's simply a description of the way the international system is structured. It's crucial to understand that this anarchy isn't necessarily synonymous with disorder. It just means there's no one in charge. Every state is a sovereign entity, meaning it has the right to govern itself without external interference. This sovereignty, while essential to state identity, also creates a self-help system where states must rely on themselves for survival. This self-reliance, as we'll see, shapes their behavior in significant ways. The state, in neorealist thought, is considered the primary actor in international politics, while other actors, like international organizations or multinational corporations, exist. Neorealists argue that states possess the most power and are the most influential. This isn't to say that other actors are unimportant, but their actions are often constrained by the interests and capabilities of states. States are rational actors, meaning they pursue their own interests and make decisions based on cost-benefit analysis. They aren't necessarily good or evil, but they are driven by a desire to survive and maintain their power. This focus on states as rational actors is a key characteristic of neorealism. It allows us to make certain assumptions about their behavior, even in complex and unpredictable situations. The core interest of states, according to neorealists, is self-preservation. They want to ensure their own survival and maintain their sovereignty. Everything else, economic prosperity, ideological dominance, or humanitarian concerns, is secondary to this fundamental goal. This pursuit of self-preservation often leads to competition and conflict, as states vie for resources and power. Now, let's consider how this anarchy affects state behavior. Because there is no overarching authority to protect them, states must rely on their own capabilities. This leads to a self-help system where states must build up their military strength and form alliances to deter potential aggressors. The distribution of power among states, what we call the balance of power, is therefore crucial in understanding international politics. If one state becomes too powerful, other states will likely form alliances to counterbalance its influence. This is a natural and predictable response to the dangers of anarchy. This dynamic creates a constant struggle for power, as states seek to maximize their own security and influence. It doesn't necessarily mean that states are always engaged in overt conflict, but it does mean that they are constantly assessing each other's capabilities and intentions. The balance of power is therefore not a static condition, but a constantly shifting process. The balance of power isn't simply about military strength, although that's certainly an important factor. It also involves economic, technological, and even diplomatic capabilities. States can enhance their power through alliances, building up their economies, and developing new technologies. Alliances are particularly important, as they allow states to pool their resources and deter potential aggressors. However, alliances can also be fragile and prone to shifting, depending on the changing distribution of power. When one state gains a significant advantage, other states may choose to bandwagon, joining the dominant power, or balance, forming alliances to counter its influence. The choice between bandwagoning and balancing depends on a variety of factors, including the cost of resistance, the credibility of alliances, and the perceptions of the dominant power's intentions. There are different ways to achieve a balance of power. One approach is to maintain a multipolar system where power is distributed among several great powers. In a multipolar system, no single state is dominant, and states must constantly negotiate and compromise to maintain stability. Another approach is to maintain a bipolar system where power is concentrated between two great powers. In a bipolar system, competition is more intense, but the risks of miscalculation are also higher. And finally, there's the possibility of a unipolar system where one state is dominant. While a unipolar system may seem stable, it can also be resented by other states and can lead to attempts to balance against the dominant power. Each of these systems has its own advantages and disadvantages, and the appropriate system depends on the specific context. However, the balance of power is not a perfect system. It's often difficult to accurately assess the power of other states, and miscalculations can lead to conflict. Furthermore, the balance of power can be disrupted by new technologies, economic shifts, or internal political changes. As a result, the balance of power is constantly evolving, and states must constantly adapt to the changing circumstances. It's a dynamic, ongoing process, rather than a static condition. And critically, even a balanced system doesn't guarantee peace. It simply reduces the likelihood of any single state dominating the system and imposing its will on others. Now, let's consider a crucial concept within neorealism: the security dilemma. Because states operate in an anarchic system, they can't be certain of the intentions of other states. Even if a state has peaceful intentions, its actions to enhance its own security, such as building up its military, can be perceived as threatening by other states. This creates a spiral of insecurity, where each state responds to the actions of others by increasing its own military capabilities. The result is a dangerous arms race, where everyone is less secure, even though no one intentionally seeks to harm anyone else. This is the essence of the security dilemma. Actions taken to enhance one's own security can inadvertently threaten the security of others. The security dilemma is particularly acute in situations where states have limited information about each other's capabilities and intentions. If a state is unsure whether another state is hostile or peaceful, it will tend to assume the worst. This is because the cost of being wrong, of underestimating the threat, is much higher than the cost of being overly cautious. As a result, states often engage in defensive measures, such as building up their military, to protect themselves from potential threats. However, these defensive measures can be perceived as offensive by other states, leading to a spiral of escalation. The dilemma arises because the same capabilities that are used for defense can also be used for offense. It's difficult for states to signal their intentions clearly, and other states may misinterpret their actions. There are some ways to mitigate the security dilemma. One approach is to increase transparency, to share information about military capabilities and intentions. Another approach is to build trust, to engage in confidence-building measures and diplomatic dialogue. However, these measures are often difficult to implement, and they may not be effective in all situations. The security dilemma is a fundamental aspect of international politics, and it's unlikely to disappear anytime soon. It underscores the challenges of cooperation in an anarchic system, and it highlights the importance of careful diplomacy and strategic communication. Now, let's delve into a fascinating and often debated corner of international relations theory, the democratic peace theory. At its core, this theory posits that democracies are less likely to wage war with one another. It's not just a hopeful idea. A significant body of empirical evidence supports this claim. However, it's crucial to understand why this might be the case. It isn't simply that democracies are inherently nicer than other forms of government. The reasons are more complex and relate to internal political dynamics and how democracies perceive and interact with each other. We need to unpack those reasons. There are actually several proposed mechanisms. The first, and perhaps most prominent, is the idea of institutional constraints. Democratic governments, by their very nature, have checks and balances, a separation of powers, legislative oversight, and a free press. These institutions make it more difficult for leaders to impulsively decide on war. It's not a single person making a decision. Many actors are involved, and they can all scrutinize the proposed action. This creates a higher threshold for going to war, as leaders need to build a broader consensus and justify their actions to multiple audiences. Around 800 words remain for this section. The second mechanism revolves around shared values and norms. Democracies tend to share fundamental principles like respect for human rights, the rule of law, and individual liberties. These shared values foster trust and understanding, making it easier to resolve disputes peacefully. When countries share similar values, they are more likely to perceive each other as legitimate partners, which reduces the risk of miscalculation and escalation. It's not just about avoiding conflict, it's also about actively promoting cooperation. Democracies are more likely to engage in diplomatic initiatives, provide humanitarian aid, and participate in international organizations. This creates a virtuous cycle of trust and cooperation. However, it's important to remember that this isn't a perfect relationship. Democracies can still disagree on important issues, and their interests may sometimes conflict. The democratic peace theory doesn't suggest that democracies never go to war. It simply suggests that they are less likely to go to war with each other. They are just as capable of going to war with non-democracies. A crucial point to consider is the selection effect. Some argue that democracies simply don't fight each other because they tend to be allies already. They share economic and security interests, and they have a history of cooperation. This makes conflict less likely, but it doesn't necessarily prove that democracy itself is the causal factor. It's a bit like saying that people who wear glasses are more likely to be intelligent. It could be that intelligence leads people to read more, and reading leads them to need glasses. The point is, correlation doesn't equal causation. The democratic peace theory remains a subject of ongoing debate among scholars. Some critics argue that the evidence is overstated and that other factors, such as economic interdependence and international institutions, are more important. Others argue that the theory is too focused on the relationship between democracies and that it ignores the role of non-democracies in shaping the international system. Despite these criticisms, the democratic peace theory remains a valuable framework for understanding the dynamics of international relations. It helps us to identify the factors that promote peace and cooperation, and it provides a basis for building a more peaceful world. Around 400 words remain. Let's move on to another liberal perspective on peace: the role of interdependence and trade. The basic idea here is that when countries are economically intertwined, they are less likely to go to war with each other. Why? Because war becomes far more costly. If two countries rely on each other for essential goods and services, disrupting that trade relationship would be economically devastating for both sides. This creates a powerful incentive for maintaining peaceful relations. It's not just about economic costs, though. Interdependence also fosters mutual understanding and trust. When countries trade with each other, they develop closer ties, and they are more likely to see things from each other's perspectives. This reduces the risk of miscalculation and escalation. Around 1,000 words remain. Now, there are different types of interdependence. Some argue that complex interdependence, characterized by multiple channels of communication, the absence of a clear hierarchy of issues, and the minor role of military force, is particularly conducive to peace. This is in contrast to traditional power politics, where states compete for dominance and military strength is paramount. Complex interdependence suggests that states are more likely to cooperate on issues where they share common interests, and they are less likely to resort to force when disputes arise. However, interdependence isn't always a guarantee of peace. There are cases where economic ties haven't prevented conflict. For example, the First World War was fought between countries that were heavily integrated into the global economy. So, what explains these exceptions? One possibility is that interdependence is more effective when it's combined with other factors, such as democratic institutions and international cooperation. Another possibility is that the benefits of interdependence are not evenly distributed, and that some groups may suffer as a result. Around 8. Furthermore, the type of goods traded matters. Trading in essential goods, like food or energy, creates a stronger incentive to maintain peaceful relations than trading in luxury items. If a country relies on another for essential resources, disrupting that trade relationship could have catastrophic consequences. This creates a powerful disincentive for conflict. But interdependence can also create vulnerabilities. If a country becomes too reliant on another for essential goods, it could be vulnerable to coercion or blackmail. This is why it's important to diversify trade relationships and avoid becoming overly dependent on any single partner. The rise of globalization has dramatically increased economic interdependence in recent decades. This has led to a decline in interstate wars, but it has also created new challenges such as economic inequality and financial instability. Around 600 words remain. Finally, let's explore the role of international institutions. These organizations, like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund, provide forums for states to cooperate on a variety of issues, from security and trade to development and environmental protection. They can help to reduce the costs of cooperation, facilitate communication, and enforce agreements. International institutions aren't just about solving problems. They also help to shape the norms and expectations of states. By providing a platform for regular interaction, they can foster a sense of community and shared identity. Around 200 words. However, international institutions aren't perfect. They can be slow and bureaucratic, and they are often dominated by powerful states. They also lack the authority to compel states to comply with their decisions. Despite these limitations, International institutions play a vital role in promoting peace and cooperation. They provide a framework for managing conflicts, addressing global challenges, and building a more stable and prosperous world. And with that, we've covered liberalism and cooperation. Let's begin by considering how we understand reality itself. We often assume that the world exists independently of our perceptions, that there are objective truths out there waiting to be discovered. However, constructivism argues that much of what we consider reality is actually socially constructed. This doesn't mean reality isn't real, but rather that our understanding of it is shaped by shared ideas, beliefs, and practices. Think about concepts like money, sovereignty, or even national interest. They don't exist in a physical form. They are meaningful because we collectively agree that they are. This agreement, this shared understanding, is what gives them power. It's not inherent in the objects or concepts themselves. For example, a piece of paper only has value as currency because we believe it does. If that collective belief were to vanish, the paper would simply be paper. This shared meaning isn't static either. It evolves over time and differs across cultures. This process of social construction happens through language, discourse, and interaction. We constantly communicate and negotiate meaning, reinforcing or challenging existing understandings. Consider how different societies define beauty, success, or justices. These concepts aren't universal. They are culturally specific and historically contingent. What is considered polite in one culture might be considered rude in another. These differences aren't due to some inherent biological difference, but rather to different social norms and expectations. This means that facts themselves aren't neutral. They are always interpreted through a particular lens. A historian studying the same event as a nationalist will likely produce very different accounts, not because one is right and the other wrong, but because they are approaching it with different frameworks and assumptions. Therefore, constructivism emphasizes the importance of understanding the context and the actors involved in shaping our understanding of the world. Furthermore, social constructions aren't simply imposed from above. They are often the result of ongoing processes of negotiation and compromise. Different actors, states, international organizations, NGOs, individuals, all contribute to shaping the meanings and norms that govern international relations. Consider the development of international law. It wasn't handed down by some divine authority, but rather emerged through decades of debate and negotiation between states. Similarly, the concept of human rights wasn't universally accepted from the beginning. It was the result of a long struggle by activists and advocacy groups to promote a particular set of values. This highlights the importance of agency in constructivism. Actors aren't simply passive recipients of social forces. They actively shape the world around them through their actions and beliefs. This is a crucial point because it means that change is possible. If social constructions are not fixed, they can be challenged and transformed. Building on the idea of social construction, constructivism emphasizes the role of norms and culture in shaping international relations. Norms are shared expectations about appropriate behavior. They aren't necessarily formal laws, but rather unwritten rules that guide state actions. Think about the norm of diplomatic immunity, or the expectation that states will honor their treaties. These norms aren't based on material power, but rather on a sense of obligation and shared understanding. If a state violates a widely accepted norm, it risks being ostracized or sanctioned by other states. Culture, meanwhile, refers to the shared values, beliefs, and practices of a particular group. It shapes how states perceive the world and how they interact with each other. A state's culture can influence its foreign policy, its approach to diplomacy, and its willingness to cooperate with other states. Understanding a state's culture is therefore crucial for effective diplomacy and conflict resolution. Norms and culture aren't static. They evolve over time and differ across regions. What is considered acceptable behavior in one region may be considered unacceptable in another. This can lead to misunderstandings and conflicts. For example, the Western emphasis on individual rights may clash with the more collectivist values of some Asian cultures. Similarly, the Western emphasis on direct communication may be seen as rude or aggressive by cultures that value indirectness. These cultural differences aren't necessarily insurmountable, but they require sensitivity and understanding. Effective diplomats are those who can navigate these cultural differences and build bridges between different cultures. Furthermore, norms and culture can be constructed and diffused through various mechanisms, such as education, media, and international organizations. These actors can promote certain norms and values, shaping the way states perceive their interests and their responsibilities. The concept of socialization is key here. States learn norms and values through interaction with other states and international organizations. This process of socialization can lead to convergence of norms, but it can also lead to resistance and counter-norms. For example, the spread of democracy as a norm has been met with resistance from some states that prioritize authoritarianism. Similarly, the norm of humanitarian intervention has been challenged by states that prioritize sovereignty. Understanding these dynamics of norm diffusion and resistance is crucial for understanding international relations. Constructivism offers a powerful framework for analyzing these complex interactions. It reminds us that international relations isn't simply about material power, but also about ideas, norms, and culture. Finally, let's consider the role of identity in shaping foreign policy. Identity refers to a state's understanding of itself, its values, beliefs, and interests. This self-understanding shapes how a state perceives the world and how it interacts with other states. States don't simply act based on objective interests. They act based on their perceived interests, which are shaped by their identity. For example, a state that identifies as a defender of democracy may be more likely to intervene in other countries to promote democracy. Similarly, a state that identifies as a revisionist power may be more likely to challenge the existing international order. Identity isn't fixed. It's socially constructed and can change over time. States can redefine their identity in response to internal or external pressures. The concept of social identity theory is relevant here. This theory suggests that individuals and states derive a sense of self-esteem from belonging to certain groups. This can lead to in-group favoritism and out-group hostility. States may be more likely to cooperate with states that share their identity and to distrust states that are different. This can create a self-fulfilling prophecy, where states reinforce their perceptions of each other. For example, if a state perceives another state as an enemy, it may take actions that provoke that state, reinforcing its initial perception. Understanding these dynamics of identity and perception is crucial for managing conflict and promoting cooperation. Constructivism reminds us that identity isn't simply a given. It's actively constructed through interaction with others. States define themselves in relation to other states, and their identity is constantly evolving. This means that foreign policy isn't simply about pursuing objective interests. It's also about expressing and reinforcing a state's identity. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for understanding why states act the way they do. By focusing on norms, culture, and identity, constructivism offers a valuable alternative to traditional realist and liberal approaches to international relations. It reminds us that international relations is not simply about power and interest, but also about ideas, meaning, and shared understanding. Now, let's delve into the fascinating and sometimes frightening world of cognitive biases. These aren't flaws in reasoning, exactly, but rather shortcuts our minds take to process information quickly. Think of it like this: your brain is constantly bombarded with data. To avoid being overwhelmed, it relies on patterns, assumptions, and predispositions. These mental shortcuts, while often helpful, can lead to systematic errors in judgment, particularly when dealing with complex issues like international relations. One common bias is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and interpret information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. If a leader believes a nation is inherently hostile, they'll be more likely to notice actions that support that view and dismiss evidence to the contrary. This can create a self-fulfilling prophecy where suspicion breeds hostility, and hostility confirms the initial suspicion. Another important bias is availability heuristic. This means we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, often because they are dramatic or recent. So, if a nation recently experienced a terrorist attack, leaders might overestimate the threat of future attacks, leading to disproportionate responses. Beyond confirmation and availability biases, consider loss aversion. People tend to feel the pain of a loss more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. In international relations, this can lead to risky behavior. Leaders may be willing to escalate conflicts to avoid appearing weak or losing face, even if the potential costs outweigh the benefits. Framing effects are also crucial. The way information is presented can dramatically influence decision-making. A situation described as a potential loss will elicit a different response than the same situation described as a potential gain, even if the underlying facts are identical. Consider the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets framed the placement of missiles in Cuba as a defensive measure, while the Americans viewed it as an offensive threat. These differing frames shaped perceptions and contributed to the crisis's intensity. Anchoring bias refers to our tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, the anchor, when making subsequent judgments. If a nation is initially presented with inflated intelligence estimates, it may be difficult to adjust those estimates later, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Understanding these biases isn't about identifying irrational leaders. It's recognizing the inherent limitations of human cognition. It's also vital to remember that cognitive biases often operate unconsciously. Leaders aren't deliberately trying to deceive themselves or others. They're simply falling prey to ingrained patterns of thought. This makes these biases particularly difficult to overcome. Mitigating their effects requires a conscious effort to seek out diverse perspectives, challenge assumptions, and rigorously evaluate evidence. This is where red teaming, the practice of having a group deliberately challenge an organization's assumptions and plans, can be incredibly valuable. Furthermore, recognizing that everyone is susceptible to these biases, including ourselves, is the first step toward more rational decision-making. Consider how these biases might have played a role in past conflicts. Could misperceptions of enemy intentions, fueled by confirmation bias, have escalated tensions? Could loss aversion have led to unnecessary risks? By understanding the psychology of decision-making, we can begin to understand why powers go to war, and potentially how to prevent future conflicts. Now, let's move from individual biases to group dynamics. Groupthink, a term coined by Irving Janis, describes a psychological phenomenon where a desire for harmony or conformity in a group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome. It often occurs in highly cohesive groups, those with strong leaders and a shared sense of purpose. The pressure to maintain group solidarity can override critical thinking, leading members to suppress dissenting opinions and self-censor their doubts. Several factors contribute to groupthink. High cohesiveness, as mentioned, is crucial. Directive leadership, where a leader clearly advocates for a particular course of action, can also stifle debate. A sense of isolation from outside perspectives, a belief that the group is uniquely qualified to make decisions, exacerbates the problem. And finally, time pressure, the need to make a quick decision, can further limit critical analysis. The consequences of groupthink can be disastrous, particularly in the context of international relations. Janis identified several historical examples, including the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, where flawed decision-making, driven by groupthink, nearly led to catastrophic outcomes. In these cases, advisors hesitated to challenge the president's assumptions, fearing rejection or damaging their careers. Dissenting opinions were dismissed or downplayed, and alternative courses of action were not adequately explored. This led to a narrow focus on a single solution and a failure to anticipate potential risks. Escalation of commitment, the tendency to continue investing in a failing course of action, often reinforces groupthink. Leaders may be reluctant to admit mistakes and may instead double down on their initial decisions, even in the face of mounting evidence that they are misguided. Breaking the cycle of groupthink requires fostering a culture of intellectual honesty and critical inquiry. Leaders must actively solicit dissenting opinions and create a safe space for members to express their doubts. Devil's advocacy, the practice of assigning someone to challenge the prevailing view, can be a valuable tool. Furthermore, leaders should avoid creating an atmosphere of excessive deference or unquestioning loyalty. Encouraging outside perspectives by consulting with independent experts or seeking feedback from diverse sources can also help to mitigate the risks of groupthink. It's important to remember that disagreement isn't necessarily disloyalty. It's often a sign of healthy debate and rigorous analysis. By recognizing the dynamics of groupthink and actively promoting critical thinking, we can improve the quality of decision-making and reduce the likelihood of catastrophic outcomes. Finally, let's consider the role of leader personality. While systemic factors and group dynamics are crucial, the individual characteristics of leaders can also significantly influence foreign policy decisions. Some leaders are inherently more risk-tolerant, while others are more cautious. Some are ideologically driven, while others are more pragmatic. These personality traits can shape perceptions, influence risk assessments, and determine the extent to which leaders are willing to escalate conflicts. It's crucial to understand that leader personality isn't simply a matter of good or bad. Even seemingly positive traits, such as charisma or confidence, can have negative consequences if they are not tempered by critical thinking and humility. Studies of presidential decision-making have identified several personality traits that appear to be particularly relevant to foreign policy. These include need for power, need for affiliation, and cognitive complexity. Leaders with a high need for power are often more willing to take risks and assert their authority. Leaders with a high need for affiliation are more concerned with maintaining relationships and avoiding conflict. And leaders with high cognitive complexity are better able to process complex information and consider multiple perspectives. However, it's important to avoid simplistic generalizations. No single personality trait can fully explain a leader's behavior. And the interplay between personality, context, and systemic factors is often complex and unpredictable. Ultimately, understanding the psychological dimensions of international relations requires a nuanced and holistic approach. We must consider the interplay between individual biases, group dynamics, and leader personality, as well as the broader systemic forces that shape state behavior. By recognizing the psychological vulnerabilities of decision-makers, we can begin to develop strategies for mitigating risks and promoting more rational and peaceful outcomes. It's a complex undertaking, but it's essential if we are to address the root causes of conflict and build a more stable and just world. Let's begin with a foundational idea: Marxism. Now, when many hear that word, they immediately think of political revolutions. But at its core, Marxism is an economic theory. Karl Marx argued that history is driven by material forces, specifically the struggle between different economic classes. He believed that capitalism, while productive, inherently creates inequality. This is because the means of production, things like factories, land, and resources, are owned by a small group, the bourgeoisie, who exploit the labor of the majority, the proletariat. This exploitation, he argued, leads to crises and ultimately to revolution. Now, how does this relate to war? Marxists argue that capitalism's inherent drive for profit and expansion leads to imperialism, the domination of one country over another, often through military force. The search for new markets, cheap resources, and investment opportunities fuels this imperialistic drive. Lenin, a key figure in Marxist thought, expanded on this idea, arguing that imperialism was the highest stage of capitalism. He believed that capitalist countries, facing saturation in domestic markets, would inevitably seek to export capital and control resources abroad. This creates intense competition between capitalist powers, leading to conflicts, wars, over colonies, resources, and spheres of influence. Think of the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. European powers carved up the continent, not out of a desire to civilize anyone, but to secure resources and markets, and to prevent their rivals from doing the same. It wasn't simply about ideology, it was about economic imperatives. The pursuit of profit, driven by the internal logic of capitalism, created a system where conflict was almost inevitable. It's important to remember that Marxist and imperialist theories aren't without their critiques. Some argue they are overly deterministic, suggesting that war is inevitable regardless of political choices or individual agency. Others point out that wars are often fought for complex reasons, including nationalism, religion, and ideology, that aren't solely driven by economic factors. However, these theories offer a powerful lens through which to understand the historical patterns of conflict and the role of economic competition in shaping international relations. They highlight how the internal dynamics of capitalism can create pressures for expansion and conflict, even when those pressures aren't consciously recognized by policymakers. Now, let's shift our focus to resource scarcity. This is a pretty straightforward concept. When essential resources become limited, competition for those resources intensifies and conflict becomes more likely. These resources aren't just oil and minerals. They include water, arable land, and even fisheries. As populations grow and consumption increases, the demand for these resources puts pressure on supply. This can lead to what's known as resource wars, conflicts fought directly over control of scarce resources. Think about the conflicts in Darfur, Sudan, often framed as a conflict over land and water resources between nomadic herders and settled farmers. But resource scarcity doesn't always lead to direct conflict. It can also exacerbate existing tensions and create instability. For example, water scarcity can lead to mass migrations, as people are forced to leave their homes in search of water and livelihoods. These migrations can put strain on host communities, leading to social unrest and conflict. Similarly, competition for fertile land can fuel disputes between different groups, particularly in regions where land ownership is contested. The effects of climate change are expected to worsen resource scarcity in many parts of the world, potentially leading to increased conflict and instability. Declining fish stocks, shrinking glaciers, and more frequent droughts will all put pressure on already scarce resources. It's important to note that resource scarcity isn't simply about the physical availability of resources. It's also about access to those resources. Even if a country has abundant resources, if those resources are controlled by a small elite, or if the country lacks the infrastructure to extract and distribute those resources, it can still experience scarcity. This highlights the importance of good governance, equitable distribution of resources, and investment in infrastructure in preventing resource-related conflicts. Furthermore, technological innovation can play a crucial role in mitigating resource scarcity. For example, through water desalination, more efficient irrigation techniques, and the development of alternative energy sources. Now, let's turn to the relationship between trade and conflict. It might seem counterintuitive, but trade can actually increase the risk of war. This is because trade creates interdependence between countries, but it also creates competition. Countries may compete for access to markets, for control of trade routes, and for a favorable balance of trade. This competition can lead to tensions and, in some cases, to conflict. Think about the Anglo-Dutch Wars in the 17th and 18th centuries, which were largely fought over control of trade routes and maritime dominance. However, trade can also reduce the risk of war. This is because trade creates shared interests and mutual benefits. When countries are economically interdependent, they have a strong incentive to maintain peaceful relations. War disrupts trade and destroys economic value, so countries are less likely to engage in conflict if they have a lot to lose. This is known as the democratic peace theory, which suggests that democratic countries with strong economic ties are less likely to go to war with each other. The European Union is a good example of this. The high level of economic integration between EU member states has created a strong incentive for peaceful cooperation. The key, then, is not simply whether countries trade with each other, but how they trade. Fair trade, transparent trade, and trade that benefits all parties are more likely to promote peace than exploitative or unequal trade. Furthermore, the strategic importance of trade routes can also create conflict. Control over key choke points, such as the Strait of Malacca or the Suez Canal, can be a source of tension and competition between countries. Ensuring the free and secure flow of trade through these choke points is therefore crucial for maintaining international stability. Alliances are a fundamental aspect of international relations, and understanding why states form them is crucial to understanding the causes of war and peace. They aren't simply about friendship, although shared values can certainly play a role. At their core, alliances are strategic calculations designed to enhance a state's security. The most prominent reason for alliance formation is balancing. States often band together to counter what they perceive as a growing threat from another state or coalition. This isn't necessarily about an immediate attack. It's about preventing a potential imbalance of power that could threaten their long-term interests. Think of it like a seesaw. If one side becomes too heavy, others will try to add weight to the other side to maintain equilibrium. This balancing act can be internal, where a state builds up its own military capabilities, or external, where it seeks allies. Balancing is a reactive strategy. It happens because of a perceived threat. But sometimes, states engage in bandwagoning, which is the opposite approach. Instead of balancing against a powerful state, they join forces with it, hoping to share in the benefits of its power. This is often seen when a smaller state feels vulnerable and believes resistance is futile. A third driver is buck passing, where states attempt to get others to deal with a threat rather than taking on the responsibility themselves. This can lead to instability if no one is willing to take the lead. Beyond these primary motivations, alliance formation is also influenced by issue linkage. States might align on specific issues, even if they disagree on others. For instance, two states might cooperate on counter-terrorism, despite having differing geopolitical goals. This type of alliance is often more fragile and issue-specific than those based on broader strategic concerns. Furthermore, domestic political factors play a significant role. Public opinion, interest group pressure, and bureaucratic politics can all shape a state's alliance decisions. Leaders might form alliances to appease domestic constituencies or to strengthen their own political positions, even if those alliances aren't necessarily in the long-term national interest. Think of a leader seeking to demonstrate strength and resolve to voters by joining a military alliance, even if the benefits are questionable. Finally, consider the role of geography. Proximity often fosters alliance formation, as states sharing borders are more likely to face common threats and opportunities. Alliances aren't static either. They evolve over time, responding to changes in the international environment and the internal dynamics of the states involved. It's important to note that forming an alliance isn't always straightforward. There are costs associated with alliance commitments, such as the potential for being drawn into conflicts that aren't directly in your interest. Entrapment. There's also the risk of abandonment, where an ally fails to come to your defense when you need it most. States carefully weigh these risks and benefits when deciding whether to form or join an alliance. The structure of the alliance also matters. Is it a formal treaty with clear commitments, or a more informal understanding? How robust are the mechanisms for consultation and coordination? These factors can significantly impact the effectiveness of the alliance and its ability to deter aggression or respond to crises. Finally, consider the concept of alliance density. A state surrounded by allies is generally more secure than one that is isolated. However, high alliance density can also create tensions and rivalries, as different alliances compete for influence and resources. A complex web of alliances can sometimes be more destabilizing than a simple balance of power. The mere existence of an alliance isn't enough to guarantee its effectiveness. An alliance must be credible, meaning that its members are willing and able to honor their commitments. Credibility is built on a history of reliable behavior and clear signaling of intentions. States demonstrate credibility through actions, not just words. This includes military exercises, arms transfers, and consistent diplomatic support for allies. A lack of credibility can undermine an alliance, inviting aggression from potential adversaries. If a state believes its allies won't come to its defense, it may be more likely to appease or even surrender to avoid conflict. This is especially true in situations where the costs of resistance are high. Several factors influence alliance credibility. First, the severity of the threat matters. States are more likely to honor commitments when faced with a direct and imminent threat to their vital interests. Second, the distribution of benefits within the alliance is important. If one state is bearing a disproportionate share of the burden, it may be less willing to come to the aid of its allies. Third, domestic political constraints can limit a state's ability to honor its commitments. Public opinion, economic conditions, and bureaucratic politics can all influence a leader's decision-making. This is why leaders often try to frame alliance commitments in ways that appeal to domestic audiences. Finally, signaling is crucial. States must clearly communicate their willingness to defend their allies, both verbally and through their actions. Ambiguous signals can create uncertainty and undermine deterrence. Chain ganging is a crucial concept related to alliance credibility. It refers to the idea that an ally's credibility is tied to the credibility of its other allies. If one ally is perceived as unreliable, it can undermine the credibility of the entire alliance. This is because potential adversaries may believe they can exploit weaknesses in the alliance to achieve their goals. Chain ganging can also create a free rider problem, where some states rely on others to bear the costs of collective defense. This can lead to resentment and instability within the alliance. Ensuring that all allies are committed to sharing the burden of collective defense is therefore essential for maintaining alliance credibility. Ultimately, alliance credibility is not simply about military capabilities. It's about political will, clear communication, and a shared understanding of the risks and benefits of collective defense. Civil wars, unlike international conflicts, happen within a state. They're particularly brutal because they often tear apart the very fabric of society. Identifying the causes isn't simple. It's rarely just one thing. A major factor is often grievance. a perception that the government isn't addressing the needs of certain groups. This could be economic inequality, political marginalization, or discrimination. Think about resources, who has access to them and who doesn't. When groups feel systematically excluded from economic opportunities or political power, that resentment can build over time. However, grievance alone isn't enough. You also need a trigger, an event that sparks open conflict. This could be a rigged election, a brutal crackdown on protests, or the death of a prominent leader. Finally, there's the issue of opportunity. Weak states, with limited capacity to enforce laws and maintain order, offer fertile ground for rebellion. A power vacuum, combined with readily available weapons, can quickly escalate tensions into full-blown civil war. The presence of ethnic cleavages, deep-rooted divisions along ethnic or religious lines, can also exacerbate the situation, making it harder to find common ground. A crucial concept to understand is the greedy versus grievance debate. Some scholars argue that civil wars are primarily driven by greed, the desire to control valuable resources like oil, diamonds, or minerals. Rebel groups may exploit grievances to mobilize support, but their ultimate goal is economic gain. Others emphasize grievance as the primary driver, arguing that rebels are motivated by a genuine desire for political and social justice. The reality is often a combination of both. Resource wealth can exacerbate existing grievances, and grievances can provide a justification for resource exploitation. The role of external actors is also important. Foreign governments may support rebel groups or government forces, providing weapons, funding, or training. This can prolong the conflict and make it even more destructive. Another factor is the selective incentive. This refers to the private benefits that rebel groups offer to their members, such as access to resources, protection, or social status. These incentives can be powerful motivators, even for people who don't necessarily share the group's ideological goals. Finally, we must consider the issue of identity. Civil wars are often fought along identity lines, ethnic, religious, or linguistic. When groups perceive themselves as fundamentally different from others, it can be difficult to find common ground. This is especially true when these identities are politicized, when they are used to mobilize support for political goals. The spiral model suggests that conflicts can escalate due to misperception and mistrust. Each side may misinterpret the actions of the other, leading to a cycle of escalation. This is why effective communication and confidence-building measures are so important. It's also worth noting that civil wars often have a long tail of violence. Even after a peace agreement is signed, the underlying causes of conflict may remain, leading to renewed violence. Addressing these root causes is essential for achieving lasting peace. Insurgencies are a specific type of civil war, characterized by a weaker group fighting against a stronger, often state-based, adversary. They rarely win through conventional warfare. Instead, insurgencies rely on asymmetric tactics, methods that exploit the weaknesses of the stronger opponent. A core tactic is guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and sabotage. This avoids direct confrontation and wears down the enemy over time. Insurgents often blend in with the civilian population, making it difficult for government forces to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. This is known as popular support and is crucial for their survival. Think about the Viet Cong in Vietnam or the Taliban in Afghanistan. They both relied heavily on popular support to sustain their operations. Information warfare is another key tactic. Insurgents use propaganda, disinformation, and social media to influence public opinion, recruit new members, and undermine the legitimacy of the government. They often portray themselves as champions of the oppressed and accuse the government of corruption and brutality. Terrorism, the use of violence against civilians, is sometimes employed to create fear, intimidate the population, and gain attention. However, it's important to note that not all insurgencies resort to terrorism. The use of IEDs, improvised explosive devices, is a common tactic, particularly in asymmetric conflicts. These are relatively inexpensive and easy to manufacture, making them a potent weapon for insurgents. Logistical support is crucial. Insurgents need to secure supplies of weapons, ammunition, food, and medical care. They often rely on external support from sympathetic governments or non-state actors. Sanctuary, the ability to find safe havens where they can regroup, resupply, and plan their operations, is also critical. This can be in remote rural areas, across borders in neighboring countries, or even within urban areas where the government has limited control. Understanding these tactics is crucial for developing effective counterinsurgency strategies. These strategies often involve a combination of military operations, economic development, political reforms, and efforts to win the hearts and minds of the population. However, counterinsurgency is notoriously difficult and often requires a long-term commitment of resources and personnel. It's also important to remember that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Each conflict is unique and requires a tailored approach. When civil wars end, the transition to peace is often fragile. Peacekeeping operations, deploying neutral forces to monitor a ceasefire, protect civilians, and assist with the implementation of a peace agreement, can play a vital role. These operations are often authorized by the United Nations, but may also be conducted by regional organizations or individual states. The effectiveness of peacekeeping operations depends on several factors, including the mandate of the operation, the resources available, and the cooperation of the parties involved. Sometimes, peacekeeping is not enough. In these cases, mediation, the process of facilitating negotiations between the parties, can be crucial. A skilled mediator can help to bridge differences, build trust, and find common ground. Successful mediation requires several key skills. A good mediator must be impartial, patient, and persuasive. They must also be able to understand the underlying causes of the conflict and identify potential solutions. Track 1: Diplomacy. Negotiations between government officials is often the most visible form of mediation. However, Track 2: Diplomacy. Informal discussions between civil society groups, religious leaders, and other influential actors can also play an important role. These informal dialogues can help to build trust and create a more favorable environment for formal negotiations. Power-sharing agreements, dividing political power among different groups, are often a key element of peace agreements in civil wars. These agreements can help to ensure that all groups have a stake in the peace and are less likely to resort to violence in the future. However, peace agreements are not always enough. Peace building, the long-term process of addressing the root causes of conflict and creating a more just and sustainable society, is essential. This requires addressing issues such as poverty, inequality, and lack of access to education and healthcare. It also requires strengthening institutions, promoting the rule of law, and fostering a culture of tolerance and respect. The international community has a crucial role to play in supporting peace-building efforts. This includes providing financial assistance, technical expertise, and political support. However, ultimately, the responsibility for building a lasting peace lies with the people of the country itself. Nuclear strategy, at its core, is about more than just weapons. It's about influencing the calculations of other states. It's the art of using the threat of force, in this case, devastating nuclear force, to deter an adversary from taking actions you deem unacceptable. Think of it like a complex game of chess, but with stakes far higher than any traditional conflict. The goal isn't necessarily to win a nuclear war. Most strategists agree that's impossible, but to prevent one from ever happening. This means understanding your adversary's motivations, capabilities, and potential responses. A key element is credibility. Your adversary must believe you're willing and able to carry out your threats. If they perceive your resolve as weak, your deterrent fails. Different strategic approaches have emerged over time, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. We'll delve into those shortly. One early strategy was massive retaliation. The idea that any Soviet attack on the United States or its allies would be met with a full-scale nuclear response. This was the dominant strategy during the Cold War. It was intended to be a clear and unambiguous deterrent, but it was also incredibly risky. The problem was all or nothing. Any escalation could quickly spiral out of control. Later, the concept of flexible response emerged, advocating for a range of options, from conventional forces to limited nuclear strikes. This allowed for a more nuanced approach, but also increased the risk of miscalculation and escalation. Another important concept is minimum deterrences, the idea that a relatively small but credible nuclear arsenal is sufficient to deter attack. This strategy gained traction as the Cold War ended and concerns about arms control increased. Each of these approaches has its own limitations, and the best strategy often depends on the specific circumstances and the adversary involved. A crucial element in nuclear strategy is second strike capability, the ability to retaliate even after absorbing a first strike. This requires a survivable nuclear force, one that is dispersed, mobile, or protected underground. If an adversary believes it can knock out your nuclear forces in a first strike, it's more likely to be tempted to attack. The development of submarines equipped with nuclear missiles, known as boomers, significantly enhanced second strike capability. These submarines are virtually undetectable and can remain at sea for months at a time, ensuring a retaliatory strike even in the event of a devastating attack. However, even with a robust second strike capability, the risks of nuclear war remain significant. Miscalculation, accident, or unauthorized launch could all lead to catastrophic consequences. This is why arms control treaties and diplomatic efforts to reduce nuclear tensions are so important. Mutual assured destruction, or MAD, is a chilling concept that became central to Cold War strategy. It doesn't imply victory or even survival, but rather a guarantee of devastation for all parties involved. The logic of MAD is simple, though terrifying. If two adversaries possess enough nuclear weapons to completely destroy each other, any attack would be self-defeating. The threat of retaliation, the assurance of mutual destruction, would deter either side from initiating a nuclear strike. It's a system based on fear, not hope. The key requirement for MAD is second strike capability, the ability to absorb a first strike and still retaliate with sufficient force to inflict unacceptable damage on the attacker. MAD is often criticized for its inherent instability. It relies on rational actors making rational decisions, even in the face of extreme pressure. What if a leader misinterprets intelligence, or becomes irrational, or believes they can win a limited nuclear exchange? What if an accidental launch occurs due to a technical malfunction or human error? These scenarios, while unlikely, are not impossible, and they highlight the dangers of relying on a strategy based on mutual destruction. Some argue that MAD created a long peace during the Cold War by deterring large-scale conflict. Others contend that it was a dangerous and unsustainable strategy that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation on several occasions. Even after the end of the Cold War, the logic of MAD continues to influence nuclear strategy. As long as nuclear weapons exist, the threat of mutual destruction will remain. However, the context has changed. The rise of new nuclear powers, the proliferation of nuclear technology, and the emergence of non-state actors all pose new challenges to nuclear stability. The potential for accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons is also a growing concern. Maintaining a stable nuclear order requires ongoing arms control negotiations, verification measures, and diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions and prevent proliferation. It's a complex and daunting task, but one that is essential for the survival of humanity. Proliferation refers to the spread of nuclear weapons, materials, and technology to countries that do not already possess them. This is a major concern for international security, as it increases the risk of nuclear war or nuclear terrorism. The more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater the chance that they will be used, either intentionally or accidentally. Proliferation also undermines the existing nuclear order and creates new challenges for arms control and non-proliferation efforts. Several factors contribute to proliferation, including regional security dynamics, domestic political considerations, and the availability of nuclear technology. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, is a landmark international agreement aimed at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. It obligates nuclear weapon states to disarm and non-nuclear weapon states to refrain from acquiring them. However, the NPT has limitations. Several countries have withdrawn from the treaty or have never signed it. There is also a lack of effective mechanisms for verifying compliance. In addition, the treaty does not address the issue of existing nuclear arsenals. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, plays a crucial role in verifying that nuclear materials are not diverted for weapons purposes. However, the IAEA's authority is limited, and it faces challenges in accessing certain countries and facilities. Addressing the threat of proliferation requires a comprehensive approach, including diplomatic engagement, economic incentives, and security measures. It is also important to address the underlying causes of proliferation, such as regional conflicts and political instability. Strengthening the NPT, enhancing the IAEA's authority, and promoting arms control and disarmament are all essential steps. Ultimately, the goal is to create a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons. This is a long and challenging task, but it is one that we must pursue with unwavering determination. International law, at its core, isn't dictated by a single world government. Instead, it's a system built on a variety of sources. Traditionally, we look to treaties, agreements between states, binding them legally. Think of these as contracts on a global scale. They're incredibly important, but they only apply to those states who've agreed to them. Then there's customary international law. This arises from consistent state practice, followed out of a sense of legal obligation. Essentially, if states consistently behave in a certain way for a long enough time, believing it's legally required, that practice can become law. It's harder to prove than a treaty, but it applies more broadly, even to states who haven't explicitly agreed to it. Finally, we have general principles of law, which are legal concepts common to most national legal systems. These fill gaps where treaties and customs don't cover the issue, helping to create a more coherent legal framework. Identifying these sources isn't always straightforward. There can be conflicts between them. A treaty, for example, might conflict with a customary international law norm. In those cases, courts and legal scholars often use principles like pacta sunt servanda, meaning agreements must be kept, to prioritize treaty obligations. Also, remember the role of soft law. These are non-binding guidelines, declarations, and resolutions. They don't have the same legal force as treaties or customs, but they can significantly influence state behavior and contribute to the development of customary law over time. Think of them as strongly worded suggestions with moral weight, paving the way for future legal obligations. These sources work together, creating a complex but vital web of rules and norms that govern relations between states. It's important to remember that international law isn't a perfect system. There's no global police force to enforce it, and states often act in their own self-interest. However, the system is built on reciprocity. States generally comply with international law because they expect other states to do the same. If one state consistently violates international law, it risks losing the trust and cooperation of other states, damaging its own interests. So, while the system isn't always effective, it plays a crucial role in maintaining a degree of order and predictability in international relations. Think of it as a set of rules that, while imperfectly followed, generally discourages states from acting in ways that could lead to chaos and conflict. International law places a strong prohibition on the use of force. This is enshrined in the UN Charter, which states that states must refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. This seems straightforward, but the reality is much more complex. There are, however, a few exceptions. The first is self-defense. If a state is subjected to an armed attack, it has the inherent right to use force to repel that attack. But even here, the use of force must be necessary and proportionate, meaning it must be limited to what is reasonably required to defend against the attack. In fact, another exception is authorization by the UN Security Council. The Security Council can authorize the use of force in certain circumstances, such as to maintain or restore international peace and security. This is often seen in peacekeeping operations, but can also be used in more forceful interventions. However, the use of force authorized by the Security Council is still subject to certain limitations. There's also the controversial concept of humanitarian intervention. This refers to the use of force to prevent or stop mass atrocities, such as genocide or crimes against humanity, even without the authorization of the Security Council. This is highly debated as it can be seen as a violation of state sovereignty. The threshold for legitimate intervention is high, and it's fraught with political challenges. Determining whether the use of force is lawful is often a complex legal and political judgment. States often invoke legal arguments to justify their actions, but these arguments are often contested by other states. The legal framework surrounding the use of force is constantly evolving, and it's often unclear where the line between lawful and unlawful use of force lies. This ambiguity contributes to the ongoing challenges of maintaining international peace and security, and the need for careful diplomacy and restraint in international relations. Human rights are inherent rights that every individual possesses simply by being human, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, or any other status. These rights are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948. This document outlines a wide range of rights, including civil and political rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and freedom of expression, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to education, healthcare, and an adequate standard of living. While not legally binding in themselves, the principles outlined in the Declaration have formed the basis for numerous international treaties and national laws. However, the protection of human rights is often a challenge. States have the primary responsibility to protect the rights of individuals within their jurisdiction, but many states fail to do so. Human rights violations continue to occur around the world, including torture, arbitrary detention, and extrajudicial killings. International human rights law provides mechanisms for addressing these violations, including international courts and tribunals, as well as special rapporteurs and working groups. These mechanisms can investigate alleged violations, provide remedies to victims, and hold perpetrators accountable. The promotion and protection of human rights is an ongoing process. It requires the commitment of states, international organizations, and civil society. It also requires a recognition of the universality of human rights, as well as a respect for cultural diversity. While challenges remain, the pursuit of human rights is essential for creating a more just and equitable world. Cyber warfare, in its essence, is conflict waged in the digital realm. It's a departure from traditional warfare, where physical territories and armies are central. Instead, the battleground is the network, the internet, computer systems, and the infrastructure that supports them. Now, you might think of hackers in dark rooms, and that's part of it, but it's far more complex. Nation-states, criminal organizations, and even individuals can participate. The goals are diverse: espionage, sabotage, disruption of critical infrastructure, and even influencing public opinion. Think of it like a shadow war, constantly unfolding beneath the surface of our everyday lives. It's not just about stealing information anymore, it's about controlling it, and the systems that rely on it. The beauty, or perhaps the terror, is that it's relatively low cost to initiate. An attribution, identifying the perpetrator, is notoriously difficult. This makes escalation a constant concern. The targets of cyber attacks are incredibly varied. Critical infrastructure, power grids, water treatment plants, communication networks are prime targets. A successful attack could disrupt essential services and have devastating consequences. Financial institutions are also frequently targeted, with the goal of stealing funds or disrupting the global economy. But it's not just about physical or economic damage. Cyber attacks can be used to manipulate public opinion, spread disinformation, and interfere with democratic processes. Think about election interference. or the spread of false narratives through social media. These attacks can erode trust in institutions and destabilize societies. And, importantly, cyber warfare often blurs the line between war and peace. A cyber attack could be considered an act of war, but it might not trigger a traditional military response. This ambiguity creates a dangerous environment, where escalation is always a risk. Defending against cyber warfare is a constant arms race. It requires a multi-layered approach, including robust cybersecurity measures, threat intelligence gathering, and international cooperation. Encryption is a crucial tool, protecting sensitive data from unauthorized access. Firewalls and intrusion detection systems can help to prevent attacks from reaching their targets. But these defenses are not foolproof. Attackers are constantly developing new techniques and exploiting vulnerabilities. International cooperation is essential, as cyber attacks often originate from other countries. Sharing information about threats and coordinating defenses can help to improve overall cybersecurity. However, achieving international cooperation can be challenging due to political differences and concerns about national sovereignty. Ultimately, cybersecurity is not just a technical problem, it's a political, economic, and social challenge. Artificial intelligence and autonomous systems are rapidly transforming the landscape of warfare. We're moving beyond remotely piloted drones to systems that can make decisions independently, without human intervention. This raises a number of ethical and strategic concerns. Think about looming killer robots, autonomous weapons systems that can select and engage targets without human control. While fully autonomous weapons are not yet widespread, the technology is rapidly developing. These systems promise increased speed, precision, and efficiency, but they also raise the risk of unintended consequences and escalation. The potential for algorithmic bias is also a concern. If an AI system is trained on biased data, it could perpetuate and amplify those biases in its decision-making. Beyond autonomous weapons, AI is being used in a variety of other military applications. AI-powered intelligence analysis can help to identify threats and predict enemy behavior. AI-powered logistics can optimize supply chains and improve resource allocation. AI-powered cyber defense systems can detect and respond to cyber attacks in real time. The use of AI in these areas promises to improve military effectiveness and reduce risk. However, it also raises concerns about the potential for errors and unintended consequences. A flawed AI algorithm could lead to miscalculations or incorrect decisions with potentially disastrous results. The increasing reliance on AI also creates new vulnerabilities. An enemy could potentially hack or disrupt an AI system, turning it against its own forces. The development and deployment of AI-powered military systems raise a number of important ethical and legal questions. Should autonomous weapons be banned outright? How can we ensure that AI systems are used responsibly and ethically? What legal frameworks are needed to govern the use of AI in warfare? These are complex questions with no easy answers. International cooperation is essential to address these challenges and establish common norms and standards. The development of explainable AI systems that can explain their decision-making processes, is also crucial. This can help to build trust in AI systems and ensure that they are used in a transparent and accountable manner. Space, once considered a sanctuary from conflict, is rapidly becoming a new arena for competition and potential conflict. Satellites are essential for a wide range of military and civilian applications, including communication, navigation, surveillance, and missile warning. The disruption or destruction of these satellites could have devastating consequences. The development of anti-satellite ASAT weapons, weapons designed to destroy or disable satellites, is a growing concern. Several countries have demonstrated the capability to destroy satellites in orbit, raising the risk of an arms race in space. The creation of space debris, fragments of destroyed satellites and other objects, is another serious concern. This debris can pose a threat to other satellites and spacecraft, creating a cascade effect known as the Kessler syndrome. The militarization of space is not limited to ASAT weapons. Space-based sensors can be used for surveillance, missile warning, and intelligence gathering. Space-based communication systems can provide secure and reliable communication for military forces. Space-based positioning, navigation, and timing PNT systems, such as GPS, are essential for modern warfare. The increasing reliance on space-based assets makes them attractive targets for adversaries. A successful attack on space-based assets could disrupt military operations, cripple critical infrastructure, and undermine national security. Protecting space-based assets requires a multi-layered approach, including hardening satellites against attack, developing defensive systems, and establishing norms of behavior in space. Establishing norms of behavior in space is crucial to prevent an arms race and maintain stability. International cooperation is essential to develop and enforce these norms. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 provides a basic framework for governing activities in space, but it needs to be updated to address new challenges, such as the proliferation of space debris and the development of ASAT weapons. The development of space situational awareness, the ability to track and monitor objects in space, is also crucial. This can help to prevent collisions, detect potential threats, and ensure the safety and security of space-based assets. Ultimately, maintaining peace and stability in space requires a commitment to international cooperation, responsible behavior, and a shared understanding of the importance of this vital domain. Conflict resolution isn't about eliminating disagreements. That's simply unrealistic. It's about managing those disagreements constructively. Think of it like a bridge. Two sides need to connect, but sometimes that connection is damaged. Effective resolution focuses on repairing the damage, reinforcing weak points, and ensuring both sides can safely cross. We often talk about different approaches. Mediation, where a neutral third party facilitates discussion. Arbitration, where a third party makes a binding decision. And negotiation, where parties directly address their concerns. Each has its strengths, and the best approach depends on the specific conflict, the power dynamics involved, and the willingness of all parties to compromise. A key element is understanding the underlying needs and interests, not just the stated positions. People often cling to positions, "I want X," but understanding why they want X reveals the deeper need that might be satisfied in another way. One crucial aspect of conflict resolution is active listening. This isn't simply hearing the other person's words, it's truly understanding their perspective. It involves paraphrasing, clarifying questions, and demonstrating empathy. Often, people feel unheard, and simply feeling understood can de-escalate a situation. Another technique is principled negotiation, popularized by Roger Fisher and William Ury. This emphasizes focusing on interests, not positions, inventing options for mutual gain, and using objective criteria to evaluate those options. It's about creating a win-win scenario, where both sides feel their needs are met, rather than a zero-sum game where one side wins at the expense of the other. Remember, successful conflict resolution isn't about winning an argument. It's about building a stronger, more sustainable relationship. And peace building goes beyond simply ending a conflict. It's about addressing the root causes and creating conditions for lasting peace. It's a long-term process that involves a wide range of actors: governments, civil society organizations, local communities, and international institutions. Think of it as planting a tree. Ending the conflict is like planting the seed, but nurturing that seed, providing water, sunlight, and protection, is what allows it to grow into a strong and resilient tree. This includes things like promoting economic development, strengthening governance, fostering reconciliation, and building trust between communities. It's also about addressing inequalities and injustices that contributed to the conflict in the first place. Simply returning to the status quo isn't enough. You need to build a more just and equitable society. A key component of peace building is transitional justice. This involves addressing past human rights abuses and ensuring accountability for perpetrators. This can take various forms, including truth commissions, war crimes tribunals, and reparations programs. The goal isn't simply punishment, but also to provide justice for victims, promote reconciliation, and prevent future abuses. Another important aspect is fostering civil society. Strong civil society organizations can play a vital role in promoting peace, advocating for human rights, and holding governments accountable. They can also provide essential services to communities affected by conflict. Building trust between communities is also crucial. This can involve interfaith dialogue, community-based peace-building initiatives, and cultural exchange programs. Diplomacy is often seen as the art of negotiation between states, but it's much more than that. It's about building relationships, fostering understanding, and finding peaceful solutions to disputes. It's a complex process that requires patience, skill, and a willingness to compromise. Think of it as building a bridge between different cultures and perspectives. Effective diplomacy involves active listening, clear communication, and a deep understanding of the other side's interests and concerns. It also requires a willingness to see things from their perspective, even if you disagree with them. While often conducted through formal channels, embassies, international organizations, diplomacy also happens informally through people-to-people exchanges, cultural diplomacy, and Track 2 initiatives, unofficial dialogues involving academics, civil society representatives, and former officials. In today's interconnected world, multilateral diplomacy involving multiple states is increasingly important. International organizations like the United Nations play a crucial role in providing a forum for dialogue, negotiating treaties, and deploying peacekeeping forces. However, multilateral diplomacy can be challenging, as it requires coordinating the interests of many different states. Public diplomacy, engaging directly with foreign publics, is also becoming increasingly important. This involves using social media, cultural exchange programs, and other tools to build understanding and trust. Ultimately, the power of diplomacy lies in its ability to prevent conflicts, resolve disputes, and build a more peaceful and just world. It's a slow, painstaking process, but it's far more effective and less costly than resorting to violence.